From the 4th century BC on, new types of oared warships appeared in the Mediterranean Sea, superseding the trireme and transforming naval warfare. Ships became increasingly larger and heavier, including some of the largest wooden ships ever constructed. These developments were spearheaded in the Hellenistic Near East, but also to a large extent shared by the naval powers of the Western Mediterranean, more specifically Carthage and the Roman Republic. While the wealthy successor kingdoms in the East built huge warships, Carthage and Rome, in the intense naval antagonism during the Punic Wars, relied mostly on medium-sized vessels. At the same time, smaller naval powers employed an array of small and fast craft which were also used by the ubiquitous pirates. Following the establishment of complete Roman hegemony in the Mediterranean after the Battle of Actium, the nascent Roman Empire faced no major naval threats. In the 1st century AD, the larger warships were retained only as flagships, and were gradually supplanted by the light Liburnians until, by late antiquity, the knowledge of their construction had been lost. Terminology. Most of the warships of the era were distinguished by their names, which were compounds of a number and a suffix. Thus, the English term Quinncami derives from Latin quinqueremus and has the Greek equivalent pi epsilon mu tau eta rho eta sigma. Both are compounds featuring a prefix meaning 5. Latin quinque, ancient Greek pi epsilon mu tau epsilon. The Roman suffix is from remus, or 5 oar. As the vessel cannot have had only 5 oars, the word must be a figure of speech meaning something else. There are a number of possibilities. The eta rho eta sigma occurs only in suffix form, deriving from rho epsilon sigma sigma epsilon iota nu, to rho, as roa is eretesen, or is eret mung. Eris does not mean either of those but, being based on the verb, must mean rowing. This meaning is no clearer than the Latin. Whatever the 5 oar, or the 5 row, originally meant was lost with knowledge of the construction, and is, from the 5th century on, a hotly debated issue. For the history of the interpretation efforts and current scholarly consensus, see below. Evolution of design. In the Great Wars of the 5th century BC, such as the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War, the trireme was the heaviest type of warship used by the Mediterranean navies. The trireme was propelled by 3 banks of oars, with 1 oarsman each. During the early 4th century BC, however, variants of the trireme design began to appear. The invention of the Quinncami and the Hexerin is credited by the historian Diodorus Siculus to the tyrant Dionysius I of Syracuse, while the quadrireme was credited by Aristotle to the Carthaginians. Oaring system. Far less is known with certainty about the construction and appearance of these ships than about the trireme. Literary evidence is fragmentary and highly selective, and pictorial evidence unclear. The fact that the trireme had 3 levels of oars led medieval historians, long after the specifics of their construction had been lost, to speculate that the design of the 4, the 5, and the other later ships would proceed logically, i.e., that the quadrireme would have 4 rows of oars, the Quinncami 5, etc. However, the eventual appearance of bigger polyremes made this theory implausible. Consequently, during the Renaissance and until the 19th century, it came to be believed that the rowing system of the trireme and its descendants was similar to the alacensile system of the contemporary galleys, comprising multiple oars on each level, rowed by 1 oarsman each. 20th century scholarship disproved that theory, and established that the ancient warships were rowed at different levels, with 3 providing the maximum practical limit. The higher numbers of the 4s, 5s, etc., were therefore interpreted as reflecting the number of files of oarsmen on each side of the ship, and not an increased number of rows of oars. The most common theory on the arrangement of oarsmen in the new ship types is that of double banking, i.e., that the quadrireme was derived from a bireme by placing 2 oarsmen on each oar, the Quinncami from a trireme by placing 2 oarsmen on the 2 uppermost levels, and the later Hexerin by placing 2 rowers on every level. Other interpretations of the Quinncami include a bireme warship with 3 and 2 oarsmen on the upper and lower oar banks, or even a monoreme with 5 oarsmen. The double banking theory is supported by the fact that the 4th century Quinncami were housed in the same ship sheds as the triremes, and must therefore have had similar width, which fits with the idea of an evolutionary progression from the one type to the other. The reasons for the evolution of the polyremes are not very clear. The most often forwarded argument is one of lack of skilled manpower. The trireme was essentially a ship built for ramming, and successful ramming tactics depended chiefly on the constant maintenance of a highly trained oar crew, something which few states aside from Athens with its radical democracy had the funds or the social structure to do. Using multiple oarsmen reduced the number of such highly trained men needed in each crew. Only the rower at the tip of the oar had to be sufficiently trained, and he could then lead the others, who simply provided additional motive power. This system was also in use in Renaissance galleys, but jars with the evidence of ancient crews continuing to be thoroughly trained by their commanders. The increased number of oarsmen also required a broader hull, which on the one hand reduced the ship's speed, but on the other offered several advantages. Larger vessels could be strengthened to better withstand ramming, while the wider hull increased their carrying capacity, allowing more marines, and eventually catapults, to be carried along. The decks of these ships were also higher above the waterline, while their increased beam afforded them extra stability, making them superior missile platforms. This was an important fact in an age where naval engagements were increasingly decided not by ramming but by less technically demanding boarding actions. It has even been suggested by Lionel Casson that the Quinncami used by the Romans in the Punic Wars of the 3rd century were of the monoreme design, being thus able to carry the large contingent of 120 marines attested for the Battle of Ecnomus. Construction. There were 2 chief design traditions in the Mediterranean, the Greek and the Punic one, which was later copied by the Romans, as exemplified in the trireme. The Greeks used to project the upper level of oars through an outrigger, while the later Punic tradition heightened the ship, and had all 3 tiers of oars projecting directly from the side hull. Based on iconographic evidence from coins, Morrison and Coates have determined that the Punic triremes in the 5th and early 4th centuries BC were largely similar to their Greek counterparts, most likely including an outrigger. From the mid-4th century, however, at about the time the Quinncami was introduced in Phoenicia, there is evidence of ships without outriggers. This would have necessitated a different oar arrangement, with the middle level placed more inwards, as well as a different construction of the hull, with side decks attached to it. From the middle of the 3rd century BC onwards, Carthaginian fives display a separate oar box that contained the rowers and that was attached to the main hull. This development of the earlier model entailed further modifications, meaning that the rowers would be located above deck, and essentially on the same level. This would allow the hull to be strengthened, and have increased carrying capacity and consumable supplies, as well as improve the ventilation conditions of the rowers, an especially important factor in maintaining their stamina, and thereby improving the ship's maintainable speed. It is unclear, however, whether this design was applied to heavier warships, and although the Romans copied the Punic model for their Quinncami, there is ample iconographic evidence of outrigger-equipped warships used until the late imperial period. In the Athenian Sicilian expedition of 415–413 BC, it became apparent that the topmost tier of rowers, the Thranatai, of the Aphract Athenian triremes were vulnerable to attack by arrows and catapults. Given the prominence of close-quarters boarding actions in later years, vessels were built as cataphract ships, with a closed hull to protect the rowers, and a full deck able to carry marines and catapults. Heavy warships. Quadrireme. Pliny the Elder reports that Aristotle ascribed the invention of the quadrireme to the Carthaginians. Although the exact date is unknown, it is most likely the type was developed in the latter half of the 4th century BC. Their first attested appearance is at the Siege of Tyre by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, and a few years later, they appear in the surviving naval lists of Athens. In the period after Alexander's death, the quadrireme proved very popular. The Athenians made plans to build 200 of these ships, and 90 out of 240 ships of the fleet of Antigonus I Monophthalmus were fours. Subsequently, the quadrireme was favored as the main warship of the Rhodian navy, the sole professional naval force in the eastern Mediterranean. In the Battle of Naulochus in 36 BC, fours were the most common ship type fielded by the fleet of Sextus Pompeius, and several ships of this kind are recorded in the two Praetorian fleets of the Imperial Roman Navy. It is known from references from both the Second Punic War and the Battle of Myla that the quadrireme had 2 levels of oarsmen, and was therefore lower than the Quinncami, while being of about the same width. Its displacement must have been around 60 tons, and its carrying capacity at California, 75 marines. It was especially valued for its great speed and maneuverability, while its relatively shallow draft made it ideal for coastal operations. The four was classed as a major ship by the Romans, but as a light craft, serving alongside triremes in the navies of the major Hellenistic kingdoms like Egypt. Quinncami, perhaps the most famous of the Hellenistic-era warships, because of its extensive use by the Carthaginians and Romans. The Quinncami was invented by the tyrant of Syracuse Dionysius I in 399 BC as part of a major naval armament program directed against the Carthaginians. During most of the 4th century, the fives were the heaviest type of warship, and often used as flagships of fleets composed of triremes and quadriremes. Sidon had them by 351, and Athens fielded some in 324. In the eastern Mediterranean, they were superseded as the heaviest ships by the massive polyremes that began appearing in the last 2 decades of the 4th century, but in the west, they remained the mainstay of the Carthaginian navy. When the Roman Republic, which hitherto lacked a significant navy, was embroiled in the First Punic War with Carthage, the Roman Senate set out to construct a fleet of 100 quinquemes and 20 triremes. According to Polybius, the Romans seized a shipwrecked Carthaginian Quinncami and used it as a blueprint for their own ships. But it is stated that the Roman copies were heavier than the Carthaginian vessels, which were better built. The Quinncami provided the workhorse of the Roman and Carthaginian fleets throughout their conflicts, although fours and threes are also mentioned. Indeed, so ubiquitous was the type that Polybius uses it as a shorthand for warship in general. According to Polybius, at the Battle of Ecnomus the Roman quinquemes carried a total crew of 420, 300 of whom were rowers, and the rest marines, leaving aside a deck crew of California, 20 men, and accepting the 2-2-1 pattern of oarsmen, the Quinncami would have 90 oars in each side, and 30 strong files of oarsmen. The fully decked Quinncami could also carry a marine detachment of 70 to 120, giving a total complement of about 400. 5 would be California, 45 meters long, displace around 100 tons, be some 5 meters wide at water level, and have its deck standing California, 3 meters above the sea. Polybius is explicit in calling the Quinncami superior as a warship to the old trireme, which was retained in service in significant numbers by many smaller navies. Accounts by Livy and Diodorus Siculus also show that the 5, being heavier, performed better than the triremes in bad weather. Hexerin. The Hexerin or Sexireme is affirmed by the ancient historians Pliny the Elder and Aelian to have been invented in Syracuse. Sixes were certainly present in the fleet of Dionysius II of Syracuse, but they may well have been invented in the last years of his father, Dionysius I. Sixes were rarer than smaller vessels, and appear in the sources chiefly as flagships. At the Battle of Ecnomus, the two Roman consuls each had a hexareme. Ptolemy XII had one as his personal flagship, as did Sextus Pompeius. At the Battle of Actium, hexaremes were present in both fleets, but with a notable difference. While in the fleet of Octavian they were the heaviest type of vessel, in the fleet of Mark Antony they were the second smallest, after the Quinncami. A single hexareme, the Ops, is later recorded as the heaviest ship serving in the Praetorian fleet of Misenum. The exact arrangement of the hexareme's oars is unclear. If it evolved naturally from the earlier designs, it would be 8 trireme with 2 rowers per oar. The less likely alternative is that it had 2 levels with 3 oarsmen at each. Reports about sixes used during the 1st century BC Roman civil wars indicate that they were of a similar height to the Quinncami, and record the presence of towers on the deck of a six serving as flagship to Marcus Junius Brutus. Septium. Pliny the Elder attributes the creation of the septium to Alexander the Great. Curtius corroborates this, and reports that the king gave orders for wood for 700 septiremes to be cut in Mount Lebanon, to be used in his projected circumnavigations of the Arabian Peninsula and Africa. Demetrius Poliorcetes had 7 such ships built in Phoenicia, and later Ptolemy II had 36 septiremes constructed. Pyrrhus of Epirus also apparently had at least 7, which was captured by the Carthaginians and eventually lost at Myla. Presumably, the septium was derived by adding a standing rower to the lower level of the hexareme. Octeris. Very little is known about the Octeris. At least 2 of their type were in the fleet of Philip V of Macedon at the Battle of Chios in 201 BC, where they were rammed in the prows. Their last appearance was at Actium, where Mark Antony is said by Plutarch to have had many 8s. Based on the comments of Orosius that the larger ships in Antony's fleet were only as high as the Quinncami, it is presumed that 8s, as well as the 9s and 10s, were rowed at 2 levels. An exceptionally large 8, the Leontophorus, is recorded by Memnon of Heraclea to have been built by Lysimachus, one of the Diadochi. It was richly decorated, required 1,600 rowers and could support 1,200 marines. Remarkably for a ship of its size, its performance at sea was reportedly very good. The Enas is first recorded in 315 BC, when 3 of their type were included in the fleet of Antigonus Monophthalmus. The presence of 9s in Antony's fleet at Actium is recorded by Florus and Cassius Dio, although Plutarch makes explicit mention only of 8s and 10. The oaring system may have been a modification of the quadrireme, with 2 teams of 5 and 4 oarsmen. Diceres. Like the septium, the Diceres is attributed by Pliny to Alexander the Great, and they are present alongside 9s in the fleet of Antigonus Monophthalmus in 315 BC. Indeed, it is most likely that the 10 was derived from adding another oarsman to the 9. 10 is mentioned as Philip V's flagship at Chios in 201 BC, and their last appearance was at Actium, where they constituted Antony's heaviest ships. Larger polyremes. The tendency to build ever bigger ships that appeared in the last decades of the 4th century did not stop at the 10. Demetrius Poliorcetes built 11s, 13s, 14s, 15s, and 16s, and his son, Antigonus II Gonatash had an 18, while Ptolemy II's navy fielded 14, 11s, 2, 12s, 4, 13s, and even 1, 20, and 2, 30s. Eventually, Ptolemy IV built a 40 that was 128 meters long, required 4,000 rowers and 400 other crew, and could support a force of 3,000 marines on its decks. However, there is no indication of any of these monsters actually participating in battle. The larger polyremes were possibly double-hulled catamarans. John Morrison argues that, with the exception of the 40, these ships must have been rowed at 2 levels.